So again, my name is Stephanie. I will be talking about common deficiencies. I was reminded at the break that a lot of people have seen me before. I've been at 3 events already this year, 2 of which I've spoken at. So bear with me if you've seen this before. I've added a little bit more into this presentation since the last time I did it. So hopefully it'll be helpful for everyone. This is really geared towards helping everyone understand what's common as far as deficiencies and the easy ways to kind of pick out where there might be problems in your programs, to make it a little bit easier for you to manage and also to understand what the regulators are looking at when they're going to audit your facilities. To give a little background about myself, I have 2 degrees in environmental engineering, so the switch to chemicals has been a little bit of a challenge for me, but I've been able to do it. Spent 7 years doing environmental engineering, and I'm in my 4th year at Risk Management Professionals, environmental remediation, dispersion modeling over at my other firm, and jumped over the compliance in CalARP, RMP, PSM, focusing on ammonia refrigeration, agriculture, and cogeneration, so all the ammonia type facilities. I also, as I said, have given plenty of webinars and presentations for various topics, and I've been a board member for the LA chapter of RITA for 2 years now. So some key topics we'll cover are the basic elements and overlap. I won't spend too much time on this since we've talked about it earlier this morning. We'll talk about a little bit of the requirements as we talk about the deficiencies, since I'm focusing more on the deficiencies. And at the end, I also provide all my references to make sure that you can all go home and be able to access everything that I've used for my presentation. Again, I know you've seen the PSM elements before, so just for a quick overview, there are 14 elements as demonstrated here, and I know you've seen them earlier this morning. And here's where the overlap comes into play. So what I've done is put together a table with each element and where in the regulation it's mentioned and how they overlap, so you can reference across all 4 regulations, federal and California. And I'll be focusing on California regulations for Program 3 since they're most conservative and all-inclusive. So if you're Program 2, some of these may not apply. For periodic requirements, it's always ongoing. To start off, everything should be a working document or working program at your facility. So you're not necessarily held to a strict standard as far as changing and making updates, but there are some outside values as well. For instance, operating procedures and emergency plans should be reviewed and certified each year. At a minimum. So if changes happen between that year or within that 365 days, you still need to make those changes before the year is up. For triennial requirements, at a minimum, refresher training and compliance audits should be performed. Again, refresher training is one of those that if the facility deems it necessary to be more often than 3 years, it should be done. This greatly comes into play with the operating procedures specifically, or if you have someone come in who may be a new hire between your standard schedule for training. And every 5 years, the CalARP and RMP submittals are due, as well as the hazard assessment or OCAs, the PHAs, and specifically in California, the seismic assessments. So these common program deficiencies come from industry, consultants, and regulators. The enforcement alert issued in February 2015. The revised CalARP regulations from January 1st, 2015, and I actually took some from Kay's presentation as well. She gave the same presentation or similar presentation at the RITA Safety Day I was just at, so I added some of those in, and you may see a repetition there. So for the CalARP submittal, some common deficiencies are that the submittal is not completed or submitted in a timely manner, and timely manner is defined as before the anniversary date. So, basically plan ahead. Make sure that you're getting your paperwork done and your assessment done beforehand, gathering all the dates that are required to be reported. That should all be done well in advance. Also, management system is not updated or in place. It should be documented on the submittal, include an organizational chart and the responsibilities of those people that are on the org chart and must always be up to date. So if there are management changes at the facility, they should also change in the submittal as well. It'd be an administrative change for that, so it would not change your anniversary date. If there are any updates to ownership or changes of ownership or contact information, again, that's kind of included with the administrative changes. And they should be updated as they occur and not necessarily every 5 years. New accident history information should always be included and updated as well. And again, going back to emergency contact information if management or some kind of personnel change happens. For the hazard assessment, a common deficiency is not having a description of the alternative release scenario. It should be considered the more likely to occur than the worst case, and it should consult best industry practice for guidance. So if there was perhaps an accident or that had that release scenario, or maybe something came up in a PHA at another facility that you're aware of, those are all items to consider for the alternative case. Worst case and alternative case should always meet the requirements in sections 2750.3 and 2750.4, which we've kind of discussed as far as, more likely to occur, that the worst case is the largest vessel on site, or if it meets one of the other requirements, and that the hazard assessment is revalidated appropriately. The population count should always be based on the most recent consensus, or the census, which was 2010 at this time. There will be another one in 2020. So any models that are done currently should follow the 2010 population census. And the updated list of sensitive receptors should happen at every update. I actually just updated someone's for one of my clients, and we had some significant changes to the receptors just based on the demographics of the area and what had happened in the last 5 years. So it's really important to go back and look at that and make sure that you're reporting the correct sensitive receptors. For process safety information, piping and instrumentation diagrams have to be updated, there's a lot of times where those will not reflect changes that have been made from MOC processes. They won't reflect changes that were just, even going 10 years back. So always verifying that these are updated. Updated P&IDs are required for the PHA as well, so it carries over into other elements. Lack of documentation for system relief design, RAGAGEP issues, electrical area classifications, reactivity hazards, and codes and standards are all very common. It's important to have these. I think the majority of these are Program 3 only, but I always suggest that if you're a Program 2 facility and already have this information, just have it available in the PSI. It doesn't hurt. And always remember to keep all your information up to date. And segueing off of RAGAGEP, I wanted to share, because I've had a few inquiries recently about what RAGAGEP actually entails. The Center for Chemical Process Safety defines RAGAGEP as the basis for engineering, operation, or maintenance activities, and are themselves based on established codes, standards, published technical reports, or recommended practices, or similar documents. It details generally approved ways to perform specific engineering, inspection, or mechanical integrity activities, such as fabricating a vessel, inspecting a storage tank, or servicing a relief valve. So what this means is your sources for what these RAGAGEP standards or practices are would be widely accepted codes, which would include building codes or NFPA standards, consensus documents such as ASME, ANSI, or IAAR standards, or non-consensus documents, which include various papers or pamphlets such as CCPS guidebooks, or the CCPS also mentions the Chlorine Institute pamphlets that are issued. So there's a number of different resources that can be used for RAGAGEP, and that should be used. It's fairly extensive when you start looking at all the agencies or the organizations that have a say in what they consider safe. And going into this afternoon, or some of the other regulating agencies that are present here giving discussions and presentations here, I encourage you guys to kind of talk about this and touch on it a little bit about what your specific agency is looking at. For process hazard analysis, the PHA needs to be conducted by a knowledgeable person, which includes a knowledge of the system, a knowledge of the set points and design of the system, and knowledge of the methodology being used. So all 3 points need to be taken into account, which would mean potentially, a decent group of people could be in the room simultaneously having a discussion about the PHA and conducting the session. The PHA needs to identify hazards properly. Again, going back to understanding codes of what this facility was built to and what's required. Any plan to address safety deficiencies, such as upgrades, should be discussed during the PHA. Analyzing where the emergency shutoff location is. Frequently, it's located on older designs in an area that could be a hazardous atmosphere during a release or an incident. So it's important to look at those features as well. Key controls, because of old industry standards, again, that kind of brings in RAGAGEP and making sure your system's operating to the best of its ability within reason. And PFVs, locating where it's not going to form a hazard on other personnel or people that may be walking by. And I've seen that where the PRV will release to a walkway that someone could be walking in. So it's very important to look at all that. Recommendations should be closed in a timely manner. Those timelines are defined in the regulation, the CalARP regulation. It's basically agreed upon timeline with the administrative agency within 2 years of the PHA or during the next turnaround, whichever comes first. And it's really important to note that. There should always be documentation for close recommendation, and they should be kept for the life of the process and include completion dates and notes on what was done to close the recommendation. A five-year update should be completed by the anniversary, and human factors and facility siting should be addressed in the PHA. Revalidations are per code or regulation should only be performed once consecutively before another PHA revalidation. To kind of bring in what a revalidation is considered, it's a critical review of the hazard review or PHA with qualified team members to verify that the past studies remain valid and that any changes of the covered process have been reviewed. This is not necessarily a new PHA, so there is a little fine line there, and it's important to distinguish the two, since the regulations do call out that revalidations can only be done once before a new PHA is done. Facility siting should always be based on current design codes and standards. Again, kind of going back to RAGAGEP and industry accepted approach as well. And there should always be consistent consideration of scenarios for risk assessment. So being consistent with risk ranking the same type of scenario with the same type of consequence, the same is always important. For operating procedures, procedures should always be up to date, and annual certification should always be performed. It could be as simple as having a signature page on the front of each operating procedure. Just having someone review it, sign off on it, it's usually very helpful to go through a procedure through the facility once a year, make sure that all the operators are following the same procedure. Again, going back to that, kind of continuing on with that, the written procedures should be synchronized with what the operators are doing in the field or at the facility. Each phase of operation should be covered, including temporary, which is very commonly missed. An emergency shutdown procedure, job assignments should always be clear. You have to remember that, especially for emergency operations, these are being used when you can assume someone's in a panic. It's not easy to use. It's not going to happen, and it's very important to remember that. Alarm set points should be documented on the procedures so that those are known right in front of someone who may be reading the sheet. And the procedures should be in the language of the users. So if you have Spanish speaking or another language speaking operators on staff, these operating procedures must be in that language as well and accessible to those people. Operating limits and consequences of deviation should always be included, and safe work practices such as confined space or lockout tagout should always be followed. For training, documentation of training should always be on file. Certification sheets, sign-in sheets, quizzes, whatever the facility has deemed necessary to verify and confirm that someone has done their training and understands it, it needs to be on a paper file somewhere. I also recommend scanning it so that it's archived in case the paper is lost. Refresher training should always be performed as needed or every 3 years at a minimum. And training should cover the maintenance procedures as well as operating procedures. So both types of operations need to be covered. Again, going back into the language of the user, that training should be provided in the language of the user. So if you have operators speaking a different language, that needs to at least be communicated to them in their native language. Mechanical integrity. The written procedures should always be available and complete. There should be a schedule in place for what maintenance needs to be done and when, and what should be checked or inspected. The frequency should be consistent with industry standards at a minimum, and specifically looking at any kind of pipe corrosion issues are common, and just sticking to the schedule versus and looking at the entirety of the system and not just specific pieces. There should be annual and or 5-year inspections performed. There's a number of 5-year inspections specifically for ammonia refrigeration with, I believe it's the B109 audits, and PRVs are pretty common. And the preventive, again, going back to the schedule, preventative maintenance schedule should always be documented, even if you're using a contractor. If you're using a contractor, get a copy of their forms, at least have blanks available to show if an auditor came or whatnot, that you know what your contractor's doing. And those hard copies should always be kept at the facilities once they're completed. Equipment deficiencies should always be corrected in a timely manner. This includes, if there's a PRV activation where it needs to be replaced, corrosion, pipe issues, valve malfunction, anything that may produce an incident later, it needs to be maintained. A facility should never operate on a failure and fix mode. And we want to emphasize that preventative maintenance is less costly and obviously safer, but things do happen, and so to have that equipment that may fail replaced in a timely manner is essential. There should be a quality assurance plan that the installation of equipment or the purchasing of equipment is done correctly, that someone's checking and verifying all that, that the hazards are communicated, and the maintenance program is communicated to those that need it. Adequate ventilation is also very common. Check the ventilation calculations at your facility if you're unsure. They may be old, maybe they may need to go back, re-verify. That's very, in relief system design, it also is very important. For management of change, there should always be a procedure in place with some basic forms and a checklist of what needs to be updated and what you should be looking for. The documentation should reflect changes in PSI, PNIDs, SOPs, and training. There are a number of other things as well. There could be some administrative changes to make to the program depending on the MOC, and it's really important to just make sure all these items are addressed. And personnel should be notified of any changes. You shouldn't have operators at your facility that are unaware of an equipment change for whatever reason. They may not know. Maybe someone was on vacation for an extended period of time, had no idea something broke and was replaced with something different. It's really important to make sure that people know and are informed of what's going on at the facility. And then also the MOC must be completed prior to startup. I don't know how many facilities I've seen in the last year that go back and go, oh, we forgot to do them. Can't forget to do them. You have to do this assessment. The analysis of the hazards, on updating the documentation, everything needs to be done before you even bring that piece of equipment on the property. For pre-startup safety review, again, the procedure is not documented. It's very common, and again, it could be a very simple checklist of the things to check for and make sure that are completed before you start the system. Documentation should be always be kept on file. Usually keeping MOC and PSSR documentation together is very helpful, so that if an auditor comes by, they see that the MOC was done and then the PSSR was done and the two dates that they were done on with the installation somewhere in the middle there. Again, this should be done prior to startup, and it is an independent analysis from the MOC. Doesn't mean someone different has to do it, but it has to be done separately from the MOC, and it has to be looked at with a third eye point of view, make sure that everything was updated appropriately. For compliance audits, frequently there are recommendations that are not correct or completed. Again, the timelines are in the regulations, and they are agreed upon timelines with the local agencies. They're due a year and a half from the audit or during the next planned turnaround, whichever is sooner. Compliance audits should always be completed by the anniversary date, and should document as much as possible about the audit, including the scope, the methods, and the findings, among other information that may be important for the audit. Program implementation should be verified by facility personnel and someone who's knowledgeable in the program and what's going on at the facility. This could mean that multiple people are involved with the compliance audit. The recommendations should always be documented with completion dates and notes on the completion, and the 2 recent compliance audits should be on file. For incident investigations, again, going back to recommendations, that there should be agreed upon timeline with the local agency, 1.5 years following the investigation or 2 years after the incident or during the next planned turnaround. And again, those are listed in the regulations. The findings should be shared with affected personnel. This affects their job, it affects their livelihood, and they should be notified of any incidents. And maybe it has to do with how they can do their job better. It's always very important to share that. And the investigation should be initiated within 48 hours of the incident. There's a set of required information, including dates of incident, dates the investigation started, details about the investigation, what may have been the root cause of the issue. These are all documented in the report, so all those items are listed in the regulation, should be followed and included. Investigation of near misses is the same as an incident, so it's really important to note that even if you almost had an accident or an incident, it needs to be reported and investigated as one. That could be something where, if something happened just a little bit different that day, it would have been an incident, so it's really important to note that that needs to be looked at. Again, completion dates for recommendations and deficiencies should always be recorded as those recommendations get closed out. And the incident should be reported to appropriate authorities within 6 months. For employee participation, again, sharing this information with your operators and facility personnel, whoever's involved with the process and who needs to know what's going on. The personnel involved with the covered process operation should always be aware of where this documentation is, where to find the information, even if they have to ask the manager or whatnot, it's in their office. They should always know how to access this. Personnel should be involved with the program development. If an operator has a key piece of information, make sure that you have your document on par. You should be talking to them and making sure that they have the input they need to run that facility safely. And documentation, again, going back to the language of the operator user, if you have people who speak another language fluently, that needs to be translated so that it can be communicated to them what's going on. For hot work permits, personnel should always be trained and knowledgeable in the process. The records should be kept on file, and the hot work area should be field verified by a supervisor. For contractors, it's really important to make sure that contractor training and procedures, especially for work and maintenance on the facility, are documented somewhere. Safety records, things like that. The facility is not responsible for conducting training or doing anything with the contractors themselves other than collecting that documentation and making sure they have a reputable contractor that they're working with. Again, the lack of contractor visitor safety training, if there's anything they need to know before they come up on your facility. I've been to several facilities where they have me sign in, and I know what's going on because they may be a client of mine. But if I was another visitor that maybe didn't know the hazards of ammonia, I would not be well aware of what could happen, or emergency exits, things like that. That should all be communicated to any visitor. Contractors that are there regularly don't necessarily sign in every time or whatnot. Maybe you don't need to tell them every time they walk in, but for new visitors, they should be informed of basic information about the facility they're walking in on. And a periodic evaluation or audit of those contractors should always occur as well. For emergency planning and response, knowing the difference between emergency response plan and emergency action plan is essential. Not having the correct plan in place, can get you in a lot of trouble depending on what you're doing at your facility. And there are some basic emergency response requirements set out by the local agencies, including coordinating with your local responder, whoever that may be. Usually it's a fire department, but whoever that may be, calling them and making sure they make a visit to your site. They understand your site. They know where things are. They understand the hazards and where the king valve and the emergency shutoff are. That's all essential. The contact information for these plans should always be kept up to date. It's actually stated that the point of contact should be updated within 6 months of any change. There should be an annual review and certification on the emergency plan, and training on that plan should also be done. So if you have an evacuation plan, to be doing that with your personnel, that they know if anyone has a responsibility to hit the e-stop on the way out or whatnot, that's all trained and planned, ready to go. Again, we're talking about a state of panic with a lot of people, where you will fall back to your training. So if you don't have someone who's trained, you essentially have not protected the community or the people at the facility. Again, going back to local agency coordination, and also having these response procedures written down, interfacing with local responders, documenting proper first aid or emergency medical treatment if that's allowed at the facility, and if you train people at the facility, any procedures related to chemical release in an emergency, inspecting emergency equipment for those who may have rescue packs or may have people who are trained to go into a hazardous atmosphere. That procedure and those maintenance activities for that emergency gear need to be documented as well, and ICS training for any relevant employees that might take part in emergency response. For recommendation follow-up, the best thing to do is assign an individual to of completing things, and it's fairly typical to see someone's name assigned to it during the PHA or the compliance audit or the seismic assessment, or maybe shortly after, to track whose responsibility is to close those recommendations out. Even if they're not actually doing it, let's just say it's a manager, that manager is still responsible for checking with the operator that was supposed to get that done. To assign an anticipated completion date, I usually recommend a year out. A lot of things can be done within the year and very well in advance of that year. And again, depending on whether it's coming from a PHA or compliance audit, you may have some more time, but a year is just a really nice even numbered target from that compliance audit or that PHA. And verify that your local agencies are agreeing with that timeline for the change. They may want something done sooner if it's a bigger hazard. I recommend documenting actions and labeling them closed. So even if, say, a recommendation may not be feasible, or maybe you came up with a different alternative fix for the recommendation, it should be documented, well documented, as what the choices were made, why they were made, the date that it was addressed, and what was going on at that time, so that it's very clear to anyone who may be walking in cold. And again, this applies to all the recommendations, so PHA, incident investigation, compliance audit, and seismic assessment, as well as any other regulatory audits. They all need to be documented as far as being closed. And just kind of follow up this whole thing, this is a cyclical program. It should always be used. One of the key things I look at if I'm going to a new facility, when someone says I'm not really sure what I should be doing, I'm looking at the state of their program. And if it's a brand new copy, looks like it's never made its way off the shelf, I know they haven't been using it, and that's going to be the first thing I tell them. So it's really important to keep this in mind, that it should be updated, it should be on someone's mind and constantly being thought of as far as, are there any improvements in the day-to-day that can carry into this program to make this place safer, to help the community out, to make sure that every person that's working here goes home at the end of every day. It's really important to keep all that in mind, that it never really stops as far as critically looking at what's going on. And so to kind of carry into the theme and to start closing this out, it's really important to note that recommendation follow-up and documentation are the two biggest deficiencies found in programs. So it basically boils down to writing things down, making sure you document it, It doesn't count. Doesn't matter how much you scream and yell at the wind that you've been doing it. If it's not on paper, it doesn't count. It's really important to hit that home, and especially for busy people, I totally understand. You got a million things on your plate, your facilities. You know, the last thing you need is to fill out another form. But if you don't do that, you could be looking at getting a lot of trouble with these regulators. You could be looking at worse, maybe even having an incident because it wasn't documented somewhere. Or recommendation wasn't done because you thought it was and it wasn't written down somewhere. So it's really important to keep all this in mind. It isn't just a paperwork exercise. It does carry over into greater importance. And some of this is very easy to do if you just make the time to do it and focus on maybe one task at a time when it's fresh. Like I said before, I include all my references in the presentation, so you guys will be able to see that when you pull the presentation up and look at the full text of any of these items that I shared with you. And like to just open it up for questions if anyone has any. Okay.